So welcome to the sixth edition of The Bridge. So The Bridge is a webinar series which we conduct every month. And this time I have the privilege to conduct this session. And this session is on China's cognitive warfare in the age of AI. But firstly, I would like to introduce the panelists here. And with me is Dr. Shiparna Pathak. Dr. Shiparna Pathak is a professor of China Studies and founding director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at O.P. Jindal Global University, Haryana. She also serves as associate director of the Jindal India Institute. She has been appointed as director of Center for China Studies, Council for Strategic Affairs. She teaches courses on China's foreign policy and international relations theory. Her prior experience includes roles at Guwahati University, Don Bosco University, the Ministry of External Affairs India, and think tanks such as Observer Research Foundation. She is a regional partner with Taiwan's Doublethink Lab, focusing on China's influence operations, and has participated in EU External Action Service workshops on information manipulation. She is the author of Drifts and Dynamics, Russia's Ukraine War, and Northeast Asia, and a recipient of fellowships from Doublethink Lab and the MHRD China Scholarship Council for Mandarin Studies and Research in Beijing. Welcome a lot, Dr. Shiparna Pathak.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vishnoi, and thank you, Future Shift Labs, for organizing this very timely and pertinent discussion. So whenever you want me to speak, you just let me know and I'll start.
Of course. And along with me is Sharon D. Sith. She's from Italy, and she's a China and technology researcher specializing in cyber threat intelligence, foreign influence operations, and digital geopolitics. Her work spans strategic policy advisory on EU-China relations, cognitive warfare, and online security. She conducts analytical research that informs governance frameworks at the intersection of technology, security, and international affairs. A very warm welcome to you, Sharon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vishnoi, and thank you for organizing this very timely workshop. Very much looking forward to our discussions today.
Yeah, great to have you. So yes, we can begin understanding our topic, but I would like to set the context here, how the overall warfare used to be fought in the history. The warfare used to be fought through armies, big armies. Then through different industrial revolutions, weapons emerges, like different weapons. First, there were swords, and the warfare used to fought on grounds. Then bombs came, nuclear weapons, technological weapons, and now the cognitive warfare, which is about how the war is being won without being fighting or without having a combat. Understanding this, brain is the new battlefield. Cognitive warfare, as the name suggests, it's related to how the overall perception and behavior can manage civilians, political leadership, and military to maybe through a mix of public opinion warfare and information warfare, and even using emerging technologies, how the perception can be managed to create social confusion, to create more polarization, to create more information warfare tactics. This is the new age where cognitive warfare has emerged. But to go in detail, I would like Dr. Shiparna Pathak to comment more on it, to comment and make us understand what is cognitive warfare, how China is doing in it, and what are the different strategies they are taking about it. Dr. Shiparna.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vishnoi. So, just to give a basic idea, see, as you mentioned, cognitive warfare, it involves manipulating perceptions, decisions, and behaviors of adversaries through psychological operations, disinformation, and AI-driven technologies. to achieve strategic objectives without any sort of kinetic conflict. Now, China's People Liberation Army has embraced the concept of intelligentized warfare, which is a strategy which was introduced in 2019, which integrates AI to influence human cognition and to secure strategic advantages. Just to give you a few examples, 2019 is not the only time wherein China or the People's Liberation Army has mentioned the usage of cognitive warfare. Even in 2022, in October 2022, there was an article by the PLA Daily, People's Liberation Army Daily, which is the official newspaper of China's People's Liberation Army, and it defined cognitive warfare as a conflict in the cognitive domain formed by human consciousness and thoughts. And it emphasized that shaping reality in China's favor by influencing human judgment, by changing ideas, by manipulating perceptions through selective information and propagation is what can help China. Now, the article highlights the PLA's intent to target civilians, military personnel, and political leaders to cause social confusion, to reduce motivation to fight, and to impair decision making. Then, of course, there's the 2019 Defense White Paper from China, which use the term intelligentized warfare, and it includes cognitive warfare as a core component. It describes warfare evolving from just information to a more intelligent format with a focus on human cognition alongside other domains like sea, land, air, space, cyber, and electromagnetic areas. So the paper, it emphasized using intelligent weaponry and IoT based systems to control an enemy's will directly. Then, if you go further back, there is the PLA Political Work Regulations, which came out in 2003. And those PLA Political Work Regulations, they outline the concept of three battles or three warfares, which includes public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, legal warfare. And these are all closely tied to cognitive warfare, aiming to influence domestic and international public opinion. Then there are loads of these Chinese military writings on intelligentized warfare, particularly after 2019. There's this one Chinese military strategist who's called Pang Hongliang. He discusses cognitive warfare within the framework of intelligentized warfare. And they again talk about AI, neuroscience, and digital platforms like social media to manipulate public opinion and to affect human cognition. There are some other reports also by Chinese National Natural Science Foundation reports on military brain science and so on. So there's a load of these documents. The question that arises here is why? Unless it is a strategy which China wants to use, they won't really be focusing so much on it. They won't constantly be talking about neuroscience, coupling it with AI, coupling it with cognitive warfare, social media platforms, and so on. There has to be a reason. Now, let me give you a very recent example of how it unfolded. So, unfortunately, Pakistan used terrorism against India as it always does in April this year, right? And as a response, there was the India launched the Operation Sindhu. Look, the battle was between India and Pakistan, right? And it was retribution for Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism. Now, China, which is Pakistan's all-weather friend, so you will see multiple of these narratives which China leveraged on social media platforms. The extent was so much that the Indian embassy in Beijing had to push back against Chinese state media like China Daily, Global Times, and so on, and say that look, stop using disinformation. And when the media briefings were also going on, Indian Army's Colonel Sophia Qureshi had also mentioned this. So this is how potent it is, right? You change the perspective, change the narrative completely. What does it really do? Them changing the perception, them changing the story, does it really help? Look, if one can use AI driven disinformation, as China did in this very recent example, it's done it against India in the past as well, then it can also achieve some of its strategic goals, which includes undermining the adversary's decision making capabilities, sowing discord between societies to weaken cohesion, achieving strategic objectives, territorial claims, global influence, without actually, getting into conventional warfare. Just to give you a real life example of how this unfolded. So when I think on May 7th itself, when Operation Sindoor was launched, that day itself, Chinese disinformation handles went on an overdrive saying that, oh, Indian jets have been down 6, 7, 8, God knows how many, right? What really happened then? So Chengdu Avik, which basically supplies the jets to Pakistan, their stock shares went up and India's defense stocks went down, right? This is how potent it was. Over the next 1 week, because India pushed back against that disinformation, again, Indian defense stocks went up, and Chengdu Avic's stock prices haven't really picked up even right now. But the fact is that this was leverage, right? So clearly there was economic gain. Clearly there was also strategic gain, cementing the China-Pakistan friendship even more. Look, unlike traditional warfare, cognitive warfare targets the mind, making it subtle yet a very powerful tool in modern conflicts. Now, this is just during Operation Sindoor, wherein the battle was not actually between India and China, but it was between India and Pakistan. That's when it was used. But if you look back, even 2020 and onwards, there have been ongoing geopolitical tensions between India and China, particularly along the LAC, line of actual control in the Himalayas. And China keeps aiming at asserting regional dominance, right? So since 2020, during and after the Galwan Valley clash, China used platforms like Twitter, which is now X, to push misleading narratives, portraying the Indian army as the aggressor and amplifying an anti-India sentiment. These campaigns used AI generated bots to spread disinformation rapidly and aimed to shape international and domestic perceptions, right? Why international perceptions? Because India has friends, right? Some of them in the West, some of them in the East, like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on, right? If it can portray India as the aggressor, which means it's not a rule abiding nation, right? So there's a fissure right there between rule abiding countries. Domestically, of course, the audience, I don't think any taxpayer would want to fund her or push her savings into a war machinery. I don't think any rational individual does that. But then there are certain cases which use terrorism. That's another story. That's a separate case. But if one can sow this sort of a discord, then there'll be a domestic pushback as well, that stop being an aggressor against China and so on. So very tacitly, bleeding by 1,000 cuts without actually getting into any sort of kinetic warfare. What China has been doing, even after the disengagement last year in Depsang and in Demchok, in Ladakh in particular, China has used AI driven propaganda to influence local communities, spreading narratives which question India's border claims or showcase China's great infrastructure development as being very superior. So, this aims at weakening local support for Indian policies and for the ruling government, right? What these campaigns do is that they create psychological pressure on local populations, potentially reducing resistance to Chinese territorial assertions. If the domestic audience itself doesn't push back against the army, the battle is 90% won, right? China has conducted several cyber attacks as well, targeting Indian infrastructure, media outlets. There was one in 2020 during the border conflict. There was one in 2021 in Maharashtra, which was one of the biggest cyber attacks we've had. And all of it gets traced back to China, which means that there is a conscious effort which is taking place from China. What is the aim out of all of this? The aim is to degrade India's operational decision making and to sow distrust in its cybersecurity capabilities. And China's cognitive warfare against India seeks to weaken national unity, exploit regional divisions, assert dominance in the Indo-Pacific without any sort of direct military engagement. Now, this is the case with India. India is not the only country which is at the receiving end. There are multiple other countries. There's Taiwan, there is US, and so on. Right? If you look at US, there's a constant pushing out of the narrative about the fissures in the American society, which would be about racial lines of division in the society, or about gun usage and so on. The problems exist in every society in the world. There are problems, but the constant amplification of it, especially by foreign handles, which might be bots, which might be accounts which change as per the needs of the state from which they are posted. Why is that done? Even with regards to India, there's a constant amplification of the divides which exist in India. Unfortunately, in democracies, divides always exist. That's how democracies are, right? So China seeks to amplify that, right? Which is why even with the US, there'll be a constant pushing out of these narratives, weaken it from within societally, right? So there is, of course, the US-China strategic competition here, which cannot be missed out, which is why the US would resort to these sorts of things. China, of course, aims to challenge American global influence, wants to polarize its societies. So what it has done even in the past is that as I mentioned briefly, it's used AI-driven social media campaigns to highlight racial tensions and governance failures in the US. As simple as a thing like there have been floods in the US, constant pushing out of the narrative that the government has failed. Look, it's a natural disaster. Unfortunately, it happens in most parts of the world, including in China. But when it happens in China, the approach is different. To portray to its own domestic audience, it showcases that the government has done much better than what the US could do in the case of, wildfires or flash floods or so on. This constant comparison, keep your local people fed with this narrative that they are getting the best in the form of a communist party, right? In the form of presenting a certain picture externally. What do? They kick out all the international journalists so that there's no actual reportage, and then they flood the information space, the cyberspace, with narratives about how great the job has been from China, which actually it is not, because Chinese people also use VPN, so one gets to know the true picture. But there is a clear cut effort which has been made here. It also reaps benefits, because again, going back to Operation Sindoor, when you see the disinformation from Pakistan, things like, oh, there's a submarine in Bihar. No submarine in Bihar. Even a foreigner can do a basic Google search and find out that Bihar is landlocked, right? There cannot be a submarine. It was substandard. As opposed to that would be the Chinese sort of disinformation, which is highly sophisticated. It'll use a lot of AI, it'll use deep fakes, it'll do voice manipulation, and so on, right? So, which means that this whole project has been unfolding for the last many, many years. How do they target decision makers and public opinion? Because I think I mentioned at the beginning when I started talking about how the aim is also at how one of the segments which this disinformation or this cognitive warfare is aimed at is also decision makers as well as public opinion. There are hypothetical scenarios which will be outlined by Chinese strategists, and all of it involve ultra small AI enabled devices infiltrating decision making circles. Example, targeting US leaders or Congress to project messages or threats, aiming to manipulate high level decisions. These concepts actually indicate China's ambitions for cognitive control. Um, Even in Taiwan, Taiwan is one country which has actually pushed back to quite an extent against these sorts of cognitive warfare. But even in Taiwan, it has been seen that there is a constant attempt in from the PRC based handles to exploit open source data, to create a different sort of narrative, to just push out vast sources of just imagery or narratives on social media platforms, on public platforms, which will keep the leadership confused. How does the leadership really believe if, say, a particular handle which has a very American name, right, and you see a constant multiplication of the narrative of the usage of the same hashtag, a leader probably would assume that this is a real cause of concern. Maybe let's put in our efforts over here. Whereas that actually might just be a fabricated thing, right? So these are all, these spring off from psychological operations. Um, what China did even last year, or during elections in India, or even in the US, or even in Taiwan, is that it used AI to monitor and influence narratives around elections in these democracies. Last year we had a lot of elections, and in most of the democracies which China sees as being problematic to its own cause, it has used a lot of these narratives. Last year, there were a lot of deep fakes which were also used, which altered the voices of some of our leaders or some of our most popular Bollywood stars. Now, The problem here is that it's very difficult to identify where the deepfake is emerging from. It's a real challenge, but it's very difficult to actually track it down to who has actually created it. Is it coming from within the border? Is it coming from external? So that gives the state or the actor a plausible deniability, right? So which is why it's also a tool which is preferred to be used. um, China's cognitive warfare, be it against India, be it against US, all of it aims to destabilize the domestic cohesion, reduce global influence, to deter intervention in Chinese strategic priorities. And one of the Chinese strategic priorities is Taiwan. US has an interest, India also has an interest. So just keep using this sort of cognitive warfare. Um, what are the advantages which China has? Look, it started early, so it has a first mover advantage. Second, it has an asymmetric advantage because China has an authoritarian system that allows it rapid deployment of AI driven cognitive warfare. I don't think populations in democratic countries would be okay with their tax money being spent on such things. Also, it's something which is not really looked up to. It's a malicious tool, right? So in democracies, unfortunately for democracies and democratic populations, we tend to be at a disadvantage when it comes to China having this asymmetric advantage, because it's a one party state. Who's going to push back against them deploying all sorts of AI driven cognitive warfare? Second problem is there's a data dependency. Both India and the US have open information ecosystems, which make them vulnerable to China's data driven manipulation. Also, there's a huge technological gap. While the US leads in AI innovation, the fact is its focus is on kinetic applications, and that lags behind China's cognitive warfare advancements. India has been trying to establish a cognitive warfare research center, something modeled on the lines of what Taiwan has. India has been trying to promote regional languages as well to counter Chinese propaganda. But then the fact also remains that there is still a need to strengthen cybersecurity and public awareness and not fall prey to, what we in common parlance in India call WhatsApp forwards. There's no way to check. But these are things which are concerns. They are being worked upon. But again, apologies for being a pessimist, but China has the first mover advantage here. Okay, in the US, there has been an inclination for enhancing intelligence sharing with allies and partners, or to develop AI resilience in programs, or to counter disinformation through rapid warning mechanisms. These are some of the things which are happening. What possibly could be done is, and I say this because the Quad Summit is going to happen this year, is maybe the four countries, and all four of these countries, be it India, be it the US, be it Australia, be it Japan, all have been at the receiving end of China's cognitive warfare, their non-stop disinformation. Maybe a comparison of certain scenarios could be done so as to understand how has each one approached this. Could we learn from each other? So just to conclude and not take up too much of time, China's AI driven cognitive warfare represents a huge paradigm shift. It targets the minds of adversaries, like those in India, like those in US, like any other democratic country for that matter, to achieve very strategic goals without physical conflict. Examples are galore, with examples, from Operation Sindhu to Galwan Valley, to disinformation against the US during elections, and so on. um, Democratic countries believe in the rules-based international order. That's the basic minimum which can be seen as a similarity between democratic countries. Democracies are different in the ways that they operate, but each democracy wants the rule of law to exist. So maybe democracies can come together and think of prioritizing cognitive security, maybe invest in AI resilience, maybe collaborate to counter China's influence in the cognitive domain. And this is, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you want to see it, this is the age of AI, and the battlefield of the mind is just as critical as traditional domains. And there's a heightened need for greater vigilance and innovation to safeguard national security. European Union's external action services, they do a lot of work on disinformation. Again, other countries cannot completely adapt those models, but there's a clarity. Just to give you an example and just to wind this up, for example, EU's EEAs, External Action Services, they say that there are 5 Ds of disinformation. And in any case that you pick up, you will see at least one of these Ds, or at least two or three. What are these? Just to give you an example, dismay, right? When, say, for example, there's a disinformation about how India lost to Pakistan using Chinese jets. What would be the effect in the domestic audience? Dismay, right? Loss of faith in the ruling government, right? So this is also long-term planning for the next elections. Or distort realities, right? Using AI, using imagery, using voiceovers, so on. Divide, constantly divide allies. You will see there's a constant narrative that India and US are not getting along. Yeah, there are problems because in international relations, countries actually not are human beings. When we say friendships, it's not like human friendships. There'll always be problems. But that doesn't mean that the partnership is falling apart, right? Or even say Japan and Korea are constantly fighting with each other. They have issues, they have problems, but that doesn't. So what is the objective here? That 1D, divide, keep allies divided, right? So there are some of these 5 Ds which European Union's external action services talks about in what they called FIMI, foreign interference and manipulation of information. And maybe we can pick up some of those ideas and maybe start educating our own domestic audiences as to how to understand what is a state sponsored approach to push out a certain sort of cognitive warfare, and how do we prepare ourselves better. So I'll just end it here. Thank you so much for patiently listening to me.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shibarna. You not only told us about the overall how China is using cognitive warfare, but you also mentioned few of the case studies related to India, related to US and Taiwan, of course. But uh, before you leave us, I have a small question for you. Like, how I want to understand, like, where do we draw the line between soft power and cognitive warfare, especially when influence operations now in today's age looks like public diplomacy?
So, there is, of course, a huge difference between, say, public diplomacy and, say, influence operations. Look, public diplomacy is traditionally done by diplomats, right? But in China, there is the United Front Works Department, UFWD, and it uses a lot of different mechanisms. So you will not really find, if you just do a Google search, you will know who is, say, for example, India's ambassador to Washington DC, or maybe India's ambassador to Australia, right? Those are our diplomats. They do the public diplomacy bit. But who are the UFWD agents from China in India? Next to impossible to actually find out, unless you have human int, right? So what they actually do is that they will not just look pushing out or projecting a country's positives or soft power is one thing, right? Those actually exist, right? If, say, India says that, yeah, there is a Buddhist circuit in India, and yes, we had Nalanda University, Nalanda is a tradition, or say Buddhism emerged from India, that's a fact. It can be verified. But then when these agents, they push out disinformation, or it's a form of cognitive warfare, it is to showcase that my country is better than XYZ, or that you know others should actually adapt to the Chinese model, right? Wherever it's not verifiable, how do you say, for just to give you an example, the Chinese model of governance is the best in the world? Is there a way to assess this? There is no way to assess this, right? This is not verifiable. Or say that, oh, India is a country which is poverty stricken and can never be a semiconductor manufacturing hub. Is there evidence to this? Yes, there are pockets of poverty, but this is a gross generalization. Also, it's putting another country down. The work of public diplomacy is to project one country's soft power. But when these sorts of things happen, this is malicious. There is an objective to this, right? Or say even during Operation Sindoor, Chinese jets have Chinese jets used by Pakistan have downed India's jets. Till date, has Pakistan even given one photograph. If the jet has been down, the remain should be in Pakistani territory, right? Is there one verifiable image? Okay, even if Pakistan pushes this narrative, understandable, because it's the adversary, India is the adversary. Why is China doing it? This is malicious, right? So it's easy, once we start putting thought to this and we actually delineate what comprises public diplomacy, how is it verifiable, what are the tools to verify, you'll find out. Say for example, there's a brilliant think tank in Taiwan called Double Think Lab, which does a lot of this work on disinformation. So they also talk about the usage of a certain sort of tools, reverse image searches, right? You can find out if it's AI created or not. Has that image been used or stolen from somewhere else? Or say use V-Verify to find out when exactly was a certain video uploaded. You'll see multiple videos and multiple posts being uploaded at the same time. Some of the times the date is not mentioned. Use these tools. If it's done in the same time frame, it is being done by a bot. It is being done as a concerted effort, right? And public diplomacy is, it's not just on social media, it's also on the ground because it's verifiable. So these are, it's like it's an evolving landscape, and I'm glad that you all have done this. This also showcases that there is a need for creating a body of literature on this, so that maybe in the next 5 years, 10 years, at least we are better prepared.
Rightly said, Dr. Shipana, and I think there is a need to work upon not only like some sort of documentizing this, but to have overall finished strategy for India as well, right? And yes, understanding you have prior commitments, so thank you so much for your time. Because Dr. Shipana have a few prior commitments, so she has to leave in a few minutes. But moving to the next session of our webinar, so we will be like Sharon is here, who will be uh, speaking more about this topic. But yes, Sharon, it's the floor is up to you. You can present if you have document or presentation, and after that we can take few questions in the time left. And to the audience, you can of course type down your all the questions in the chat section.
Great, thank you, Mr. Vishnoy. I would like to kind of build on what Dr. Shiparna has just mentioned and kind of go a bit deeper in the big picture. So really what China is doing with cognitive warfare and influence operation isn't just random or reactionary to the current world stage. It's really deliberated and long-term strategy. Dr. Shiparna mentioned laws in 2020, 2003, 2015, and 2022. But in reality, let's say this mentality of the Sinocentric mentality dates really back to when China was an empire, so really long time ago. In fact, China really believes that all its power should be projected in what they call Tianxia, literally under heaven. Historically, this space was what the heaven, so the godly power, gave the emperor. Now that the emperor is no longer there, this emperor is the CCP. So really, the Chinese Communist Party sees control over information, identity, and public opinions are essential to its survival. This is especially true when it comes to ethnic minorities like Uyghurs, Tibetan, or democratic societies like Taiwan, which, of course, challenge the CCP, let's say, claim of unity and sovereignty. CCP doesn't just fight with armies and trade, but it fights for minds and narrative as a space. It is really important for China. It's a war to be won, and Taiwan is become the front line. When preparing for this webinar, I asked myself as well, why is Taiwan so important to China's strategy? Well, that's because Taiwan sovereignty really poses a threat to the CCP legitimacy. Taiwan is a democracy, it has a separate identity, and it also represents, like its existence really represents an alternative political path for people who speak Mandarin. So given also Taiwan proximity, the language overlap, and also its challenge international status, Taiwan is not recognized by many states. Of course, these, let's say, factors made Taiwan a real-world testing lab for PRC-sponsored FIMI techniques, AI-generated content, and also cyber influence and attack. Speaking about TTPs and AI-powered TTPs, I would like to give you some example, very recent, to kind of build on what we just said. First of all, one TTP that comes to my mind are generated video and fake news. This is very common, as Dr. Shiparna said, in very many countries, but for Taiwan, this is really a daily threat to their national sovereignty. An example is in January 2024, right before Taiwanese election, the then candidate Lai Ching-te, which is now the president of Taiwan, made a campaign video to promote its presidential election. This video was manipulated by CCP-sponsored actor using the fake technology to spread a fake scandal about Lai. Basically, the video showed Lai declaring he had an extramarital affairs, thus, of course, undermining his reputation. And the goal for China was not to make him elected, because the DPP, historically in Taiwan, has had very strong independentist stances and was very vocal about China and its practice on the global stage. Another AI-generated technique, which is now very popular in Taiwan, is AI-generated news anchors. These news anchors basically spread their content on a variety of China-led YouTube channels that they read scripts that are fabricated by China. The scripts, of course, mirror official Chinese narrative about Taiwan. So they criticize the ruling party, they criticize the quality of Taiwanese democracy. And what is also very important is that they mimic real newscasts to seem legitimate. So you can see here that it's really getting more and more difficult for the Taiwanese civil society also to get access to clean and to unbiased information. The goal for China in Taiwan is really to push out so much misleading content that it becomes hard for people to understand what is true and what is not. This, of course, generates division and polarization. And it is particularly true on topics that are important to the PRC survival, such as US relations or national defense. So they really want Taiwan to be even more isolated. I would like to stress that these techniques, the AI generated, are not the only techniques that are used in Taiwan and abroad. China uses systemic campaign and cross-platform campaign, which means that often the same content about Taiwan that it is spread mistakenly in Taiwan by China is then also offline posted in a Chinese newspaper and also spread by Chinese diplomats abroad. So there is really a combination of online and offline technique when we speak about Chinese psychological warfare. Psychological warfare for China in Taiwan and abroad also is about economics. So it's really important to understand that the objective is really to create a mentality of fear in which everyone that stands against the official view promoted by Beijing might risk, for instance, sanction. It happens in Lithuania when the Taiwanese representative office opened in Lithuania. What China did was to impose sanction on Lithuanian product or boycott Lithuanian product, thus causing Lithuania to lose a significant part of its GDP. So it's really important that AI exists, but it's just making cognitive warfare faster, cheaper, and harder to detect. This does not mean that the cognitive warfare of China is only about AI, but it's really, let's say, AI, what it's doing is making it more powerful and cheaper for scaling, let's say. This is not about Taiwan, because what China wants to do is really to reshape how the world thinks about China and also to reshape the world order. Beijing was once a status quo, which is more favorable to China. So media, academia, public opinion, diaspora, and economic actors are all cognitive terrain to be seized, just like in war, but they are cognitive terrains and not just influence. China wants to own them, to shape them in order to build a world order that is more favorable to the CCP, which means, for instance, normalizing authoritarian multipolar worldviews. For the CCP, this technique is not cognitive warfare, but it's called Huayuchuan, discourse power. So basically the power to define what counts as truth. I also ask myself, and I want to share with you, what are the factors that make country good target for Chinese propaganda or infamy operation? Well, I think that there are 4 factors that might make a country a better target. First of all, countries that have limited media freedom and countries that have laws that limit or restrain governmental investigative power are good targets, meaning media is already very controlled. Once I get access to the gatekeeper, then I'm sure that my message will go through. At the same, if I have a country which is becoming authoritarian, this is also a good moment for China and for other states that do cognitive warfare to start actually those kind of campaign. Of course, nations who are vocal or critical of China's human rights records also are good targets. Any place that has Chinese or Uyghur diaspora have by design language proximity with the PRC. So this makes extremely easier for China to disseminate pro-CCP content, or on the other hand, to delay it. It's also important. Cognitive warfare is also about taking out access of information. So by censorship, self-censorship, meaning intimidating diaspora not to talk in fear or reprisal, but also to manipulate with laws data flows. China, since 2015, is really starting to own data flows, doesn't share them. It blocks telecom company abroad to invest in China in the fear of getting, of course, giving too much access to data. So this is also an important element, the information suppression. And finally, I want really everyone to realize that every country where China has economic interest is a good target. In this case, cognitive warfare often takes the form of cyber-enabled economic espionage, because China doesn't want to trigger a war because it has an interest in this country, but at the same time wants the information there. So this is why, let's say, the cyber attack is a good instrument to carry out this kind of operation. Let's look a bit of a few examples of these let's say, countries and how this strategy plays out globally. I would like to bring a bit more example on other, let's say, areas of the world compared to what my colleague just mentioned, and focusing on Latin America, Canada, and briefly Europe. In Latin America, when it comes to AI-powered TTPs, China has used the tools, very simple ones like ChatGPT, to write and translate pro-China articles that appear in official Spanish language media. It is really important to note that China often sponsors the fabricated content to appear in official media. This means that there is a money investment, which is not a thing that every state does. So there is really an economic investment in foreign propaganda to spread pro-Chinese narrative abroad. Another important aspect in Latin America is the existence of fake social media accounts that post identical content praising China technological breakthrough. This is because China has a very strong internet currently in Latin America when it comes to infrastructure, telecommunication projects. So, of course, showcasing China's tech and science achievement make it seem that the population is accepting those type of investment. What is interesting is that studies have shown that those accounts, the content posted in those accounts is also then reproduced offline by local Latin American influencers, especially in Peru and Mexico, and also by local Chinese diplomats. So you really think that the message that has been carried out is grassroots, is authentic, and is also approved by the local population. Moving to Canada, I would like to cite the importance also of cyber campaigns. In 2024, the Canadian government has exposed a campaign that was linked to Chinese actors. The campaign was called Spamouflage. So the tactic employed by this campaign include deepfake video and that targeted Canadian citizens from Chinese diaspora. This campaign was particularly intense, and I would like to mention this because we are not speaking about targets who are government or institution, but we are speaking about private citizens that were critics of the Chinese government. This campaign also includes sexually explicit fake photos of the targets. So as you can see, the impact on the personal life of the target was pretty strong. And also doxing. So basically what the video did were disclosing personal information of the targets online without their consent. So here we also, on a human rights perspective and a digital rights perspective, an interesting and pretty, I would say, scary as well nuance when it comes to cyber operation. The Spamouflage campaign was also present in Europe, albeit with less intensity. But what I want to focus on when we speak about Europe very briefly is that the Chinese and Russia media ecosystem in Europe amplify each other's narratives. This is very important, especially after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine from Russia. Everything that relates on NATO or the war in Ukraine is really amplified by each other's media. The goal is, of course, to spread anti-Western messages in areas such as the Balkan or Central Europe, which in the European Union dynamics are already, let's say, a bit, let's say, where the relationships are a bit problematic or tense, given, of course, also the Russia position on the war in Ukraine. To quickly, let's say, wrap up, I would like just to mention one last thing, and it's the cyber dimension. I mentioned before that Chinese cognitive warfare is not about content, but it's about access to information. This is particularly true when there is an economic interest of China in a target country. I would like to bring you two examples. The first one is in the African continent, where a cybersecurity firm and CTI professional have tracked Chinese linked group, which is APT41, that has targeted the government IT system in Kenya and Zambia. The point for the Chinese state was not to only spy, was to really gain access to data and use that data to leverage negotiation. And of course, by consequence, get a better deal with those countries and also influence political decisions made within those countries. This is really important. Malware was deployed, malware that was also, let's say, coded using AI. And it is also why it was, let's say, researchers will be able to track. There were some pieces of code that were in Chinese language. So this is also an interesting bridge between AI and then cyber attacks. Finally, Taiwan also very recently in early July was targeted by Chinese hackers. The research was made by Proofpoint researchers, and they highlighted that around 15 to 20 firms in Taiwan and the US were targeted by Chinese hackers. What is interesting is that this campaign were targeting companies that were involved in the semiconductor supply chain. So, of course, semiconductor is right now at the center of a big geopolitical dispute and what we call also tech war or a tech geopolitical competition, whatever we want to say. The fact that China went to target Taiwanese semiconductor supply chain is really, again, to disrupt that supply chain, especially trying to get leverage for China in tech negotiation, and in the context of the trade war with the US, this is also particularly important. So this highlight, I wanted to mention this attack because it really highlights a pattern. Beijing is really increasingly targeting not only governments, but also economic leaders, citizens, and anyone that shapes market narrative or policy perspective. So really, it's really important to have this awareness. Like if you're a private citizen or a small firm doing something, you can be a target. This was not, of course, to raise panic, but to kind of slowly giving you my takeaways to all of this. We are really facing a new kind of conflict, really, that is not fought with bombs or tanks, but also with information, emotion, and trust. This is very important. I think that democracies, we need really to invest in media literacy, invest in cyber hygiene is really important to maintain our IT and telecom infrastructure safe. So we spend money on that. Many of the cyber attacks in reality come because the infrastructure is poorly maintained. So there is vulnerability that gets exploited. If we invest more in that, we are getting better at defending against also cognitive warfare. And we also need to raise AI awareness, both for professional, but especially for broader civil society. Secondly, I think we need to better support journalism and academic freedom. This is a bit of a pain for every democracy right now. Fundings for academia, for independent journalism are not very high at the moment. We need better policy to, of course, help them thrive, but also we need economic tools to support them against strategic lawsuits. I'm saying so because many state actors, and China especially, is using strategic lawsuits, so use of law and tribunals to intimidate academia, think tankers, and also journalists not to speak about the action of China or to comply with Chinese will. We need to kind of help those entities to really combat that in court as well. To do so, I would like to end with the importance of exposing and holding accountable the networks and the state actors that enable cognitive warfare campaign. In the recent EU-China summit in Beijing that happened yesterday, the final declaration from the European Union also recognized that we need, as democracy, a more even playing field when it comes to cyber. And we invited as well China to collaborate on that. And this is very important because it's one of the very recent statements that recognizes that China is doing something wrong on the cyber domain. So I think that it's important to hold states accountable. It's also important to collect proofs. So we really need also to build a data sharing system for tracking, for instance, cyber-enabled cognitive warfare. And we also need to train our lawyers, our police forces to understand what cognitive warfare is. And so to protect really the whole of our societies. On my side, I conclude. I hope it was comprehensive and I managed to let's say, build on what Dr. Sriparna very well explained just before. And I thank you, Sagar, for your attention and also to all the participants.
No, thank you so much for such brilliant insights across the globe. You mentioned about from case study from Latin America. You mentioned about case study from African region and even from Europe. You also mentioned how the economic cyber espionage is taking place and why, as a countermeasure, strategies at different levels are required, whether it is legal or at law enforcement agencies level, or even having a robust cyber diplomatic or I